All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipovich Show is my buddy Ari Berman. Ari's work has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine, which you can find at thenation.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Ari Berman. Ari, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Matt.
All right, so Ari, since the Supreme Court's ruling on the Voting Rights Act, we've seen tons of red states begin to ramp up laws to disenfranchise voters all over the country. The biggest example so far that we've seen is actually in North Carolina. So tell us, what's the status in North Carolina?
Yeah, so 7 southern states have passed or implemented new voting restrictions since the Supreme Court's decision in late June. North Carolina's is by far the worst because there's so many bad provisions in the bill. It's been described in the news as a voter ID bill, but it's really much, much worse. It essentially is an anti-voting, pro-corporate money, really Frankenstein monster. And in terms of what it does on the voting piece of it, it not only mandates strict voter IDs, so no student IDs, no public employee IDs allowed, which makes it one of the strictest in the nation, but it cuts early voting by a week, even though 56% of North Carolinians voted early. It repeals same-day voter registration during that early voting period, so you can't show up anymore during early voting, register to vote, and vote on the same day. 100,000 people used that in the last election during the general election in 2012, and it's particularly important for younger people who often don't pay attention to elections until right before. That way they can register and participate in the process. I think a lot of people won't get around to registering without same-day registration. It does other things, less high-profile but very significant. For example, if you show up in the wrong precinct and you cast a provisional ballot, it will no longer count. So that's potentially thousands of votes that won't count anymore. It does another thing. It authorizes the county chairs to appoint all these poll watchers who can challenge eligible voters. Interestingly enough, you don't have to be from the right precinct if you want to challenge someone at the polls, but if you're on the right precinct and you vote, it won't count, which is kind of an odd way of thinking about things. It eliminates public financing of judicial elections. It gets rid of pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. It gets rid of Citizens Awareness Month to encourage people to register to vote. At the same time, it does all these things on the money front where candidates don't have to say who's paying for their ad. You can give more money to political candidates now. You can put more unregulated money through the state parties. So this really is kind of an unprecedented attempt to make it harder for certain people to vote while making it easier for other people to have way more influence in terms of the funding of political campaigns.
It's insane, and it really just seems like they've just been waiting to do all of this stuff for so long, and then finally the Supreme Court lets them loose, and they're just blah, and literally all of this stuff just comes, this hateful disenfranchisement just comes spewing out of these right-wing maniacs.
Well, and you have to broaden it out a little bit in North Carolina because they've pushed so many extreme policies that the voting thing is just the last thing they did. I mean, so they got into office, they ended the earned income tax credit for nearly 1 million people. They declined Medicaid expansion for 500,000 people. They kicked 170,000 people off unemployment benefits in a state with the 5th highest unemployment rate in the country. They passed an abortion ban under the guise of first a Sharia law bill and then a motorcycle safety bill. I mean, so this is really how they've been operating. So they passed all these extreme policies. They passed, for example, a tax plan that's going to cut taxes for the richest North Carolinians and raise taxes on everyone else. So after passing all these extreme policies, the legislature's approval rating was about 20%. So what do then? They make it harder for all those people opposed to the policies to be able to vote them out of office. And so it really is just a brazen power grab once you understand the context that this was all in. This was the last thing they did before they left for the legislative session because they knew that what they were doing was so unpopular. They had to essentially, they couldn't defend it at the ballot box. They really decided they just needed to make it harder for their opponents to be able to vote. And more recently, since this law has been enacted, there's been all these attacks on student voting. They've been shutting down early voting sites on college campuses. They've been challenging the registration of college students who have lived, for example, where they go to college for the last 4 years, saying they can't run for office in the local county. So really we've seen even after this horrible bill has been passed an escalation of voter suppression efforts, which I think really shows the true intent of this law.
what is the makeup of the actual the state government in North Carolina? Because I mean, North Carolina, Obama took North Carolina in 2008, and it wasn't. I believe it was he only lost by like a point and a half or something in 2012. How? I mean, I know obviously what a lot of it is gerrymandered and whatnot, but what is the actual makeup? Is because the state, at least presidentially, does seem to be fairly purple.
Well, 2010 was a terrible year for North Carolina Democrats, and it was a very good year for North Carolina Republicans. And that meant that Republicans had huge majorities. The first thing they did was pass these incredibly gerrymandered maps, which the governor at the time, a Democratic governor, couldn't veto. They essentially accomplished this by packing as many minority voters into as few districts as possible, so the rest of the state would be controlled by white Republicans, essentially resegregating what had been a very racially integrated swing state. So North Carolina went from a 7-6 Democratic to Republican state on the congressional level to a 9-4 Republican to Democrat state after 2010, even though 51% of voters voted for a Democratic House candidate. So really, first you have to understand that this is just an insane gerrymander to try to protect their power. Then in 2012, again a very good year for North Carolina Democrats. Republicans took the governor's office. They were benefited tremendously in both cases by money from Art Pope, the North Carolina version of the Koch brothers, who's very tight with the Koch brothers himself. He put up a few $1 million in 2010 and then $500,000 to elect Pat McCrory. McCrory then put Pope into the governor's office as essentially his head of the budget, which really is kind of an insanely brazen FU to all the people in the state who don't like Art Pope and really, I think, show that he wasn't going to govern as a moderate. And so what you have now is you have a situation where Republicans are in control of the state with large majorities for the first time in 100 years. Not only do they have that control, but when McCrory took over, he got to appoint the head of the Board of Elections in every single county. So you have Republican-dominated election boards in every single place, and that means they can do things. They have the power, for example, to do things like close early voting sites on college campuses, kind of arbitrarily, simply because they now have the power of the governor's mansion.
Unbelievable. I'm talking to Ari Berman from The Nation magazine, thenation.com. So there are some court challenges to the voter suppression law that's happening in North Carolina. Describe the challenges and maybe what you think the chances are of it to actually succeed or not. Sure.
So there's two challenges filed under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which applies nationwide. But unlike Section 5, which is now inoperable, you have to challenge these cases. Basically, the plaintiffs have to show the burden of proof that these laws are discriminatory, not the states themselves. So the states, basically how it works under Section 5 is laws were frozen until states were able to convince either the courts or the Justice Department that they were not discriminatory. Now it's the opposite. Laws are in effect until those challenging the discrimination can prove that the laws are discriminatory, which is a much higher burden of proof for those that are trying to fight voter suppression. It's still possible that these laws could be blocked under Section 2 of the VRA. The cases have been given to a judge who is a George W. Bush appointee, which makes me a little bit less confident, although we have seen Republican judges block these laws in other states. Then there's a third challenge that's been filed under state court, essentially alleging that the voter ID law represents the legislature taking a power that it doesn't have, that the legislature doesn't have power to basically set new voting qualifications. The other laws are challenged under Section 2, which basically argues that these laws, at least the chunk of them, are racially discriminatory. Because if you look at the numbers, African Americans are much, much, much more likely to use early voting, to use same-day registration, to not have IDs, to vote out of precinct with provisional ballots, to be challenged at the polls by poll watchers, and so that's why they're challenging these laws as racially discriminatory.